What is up, YouTube fam? Robbie C here. Today we're going to talk about building your bag in a way that I think we've done before, and in fact we run a podcast over on the Foundation Podcast Network called In the Bag, which covers topics like this on a regular basis. However, a few weeks ago we had a guest on who created such an interesting conundrum in my head, almost taking me back to the Leonardo DiCaprio days of Inception, and he's planted something that's grown into something magnificent, and I really think that it could have a dramatic impact on how we look at building bags, especially if you are a newer player and you often see all these players walking around with these massive bags filled with discs, and you're like, man, why do they need 25? Why do they need 30 discs? Even I think if we go back to like a Chris Dickerson video in 2020, I think he had like 60 different discs in his bag. But what if you didn't even own a big bag? What if you were in a Dynamic Disc Trooper or like a Grip G series or the Sniper equivalent? Bringing us to the question of today's video: how many discs do you actually need in your bag, and what shots are you looking to cover with those discs? Let's jump on it. If you haven't caught on, our sport is called disc golf. And when you think about golf, which is our sort of father sport, or however you want to look at it, something that gets talked about quite often is a club limit that is placed on players in golf, which I believe is 14. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. It limits players from having 6 different drivers or having a multitude of wedges that go from like a 45 to a 46 to a 48 to a 49. However, this limit becomes very tough inside of disc golf because it's not as punishing to lose a golf ball while you're out there playing golf, whereas with disc golf, your ball and the club are all combined into one option. So if you have a water carry and you're a little off that day, glory's going home a little sooner than you planned, and now you're just down an entire club or an entire disc in your bag. But if I'm working with a player, I do think that limiting the amount of options in your bag can help you hone in your skills and actually make you a better player, especially when you're a newer player. I think that having fewer discs in your bag overall is going to make you think a lot less about what disc you should throw on this shot, and much more like we talked about in the video at the beginning of this week, what is the hole asking of you? And when you have less options in your bag, you can sort of look at it and know, hey, I do have this shot, or no, I don't have this shot. So I think if we went with a minimalist bag for a intermediate-ish player, my number I'm landing on would be 14 discs. Then looking at the throwing options, you want a disc that's going to go to the left, you want a disc that's going to go straight, and you want a disc that's going to go to the right. Of course, we're talking about backhands with that. If you went forehand, a disc that goes really far this way on a backhand could also go really far this way on a forehand, but that also might be a little too complicated even for beginners to look at. So with these 3 options, you could have them in the putter slot, you could have them in the mid-range slot, you could have them in the fairway slot, and you could have them in the driver slot. That would be 12 discs listed across those with your 2 putting putters, and voila, we're at 14. But I still think that is just a little too easy, and I really wonder, even looking at that spread, do we actually need all of those discs in order to really achieve the shots we're looking for, especially for a player that is newer or getting into the game, or even a player that I'm going to go ahead and say isn't throwing more than like 250 feet. So how many discs then would I recommend? Well, that's interesting. I think we're going to talk through it and see where we land. Let's dive into putters. When it comes to putting putters, I really suggest you have a disc in your bag that is specifically used for putting. If you want to go super minimalist, obviously you can have one putter that you end up throwing and using for putting as well. The hard part with that is if you throw the disc, it's eventually going to hit some trees. I don't care who you are or how good you are. And when it hits those objects, there's a chance that you could chunk that plastic and things could come out of it, which means that when I'm putting, rather than being able to focus on my putting stroke, I might have like a weird notch in it or something that feels like it's going to get hung up on my hand, which is going to distract me from the actual putt. The reason I like having 2 putting putters is because that exact same thing might happen even if I'm throwing the putter at the basket. It might hit the band, it might jasper right into the cage and get a chunk out of it, and in which case I always have a backup. Oh, our throat got a little clogged there, just thinking about our precious putting putters getting hurt. Sorry guys. I also think if you're playing practice rounds or casual rounds by yourself, in order to get better and get more efficient use out of your time while you're on the course, if you have 2 putting putters, you can always putt twice from every time that you do putt. And that means that if you make every putt, you're still gonna get 36 putts while you're out there on the course rather than just the normal 18. However, from the minimalist standpoint, I can totally understand we're wanting to limit the number of discs in our bag. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that we don't need 2 putting putters in our bag. We can drop to 1 in this approach. Next, we head into the throwing putter slot with an understable, an overstable, and a neutral option in this slot. How useful do I think all 3 of these are? Well, this is the first one that I think is gonna be rather boring or straightforward, because if you don't throw super far, a putter is going to be one of the most useful things that you can throw, because you're going to get a lot of natural flight out of the putter. You're gonna get the putter to fly as it's supposed to, because lots of people can actually put the amount of spin, power, and rotation into a putter to get it up to speed. If you're looking at those basically 4 random numbers called flight numbers on the disc, speed is the first one. And if you can't inject enough power or spin into the disc to reach that threshold, then the rest of the numbers don't matter anyways. So because you can most often get putters up to speed, I think that all 3 of these slots are useful because they're going to give you a variety of options. Starting with the understable side, what this opens up for you is the opportunity to throw some sort of turnover shots, which is naturally going to get the disc moving in the opposite direction. And you can also try out hyzer flips with this understable option, which means if you throw it with that outside edge down, it's going to stand up when you throw it, which is going to cause it to go really straight, which is arguably the hardest shot to throw in disc golf, is the pure straight shot. Understable also works really well if you find yourself in the trees and you can like sort of throw it up and out. Super great. Understable putters are the bomb. As for the straight or neutral option, you can find a disc that naturally fills that slot, or you can find a disc that sort of teeters the line on the neutral to understable side just slightly, or on the neutral to overstable side just slightly. I have an inner core which lives on that neutral to understable side, and then I have this beat in of a pig which lives on the neutral to overstable side. I can throw these a little bit differently and still get that straight shot that I'm looking for every time when I don't want the understable side of the disc that we talked about before. And of course, the big hit here being the overstable option. And for this, what I'm really looking for is a putter that I can put some oomph into, you know, like really lay into this disc, and it still is going to hold and then have some solid finish at the end. That means that it's going to fall out into the natural spin that I put on it. For right-handed players, that means if I'm throwing a backhand, I'm naturally spinning the disc in a way that makes it want to go left. And if I'm throwing a forehand with the disc, putting enough spin on it for a right-handed player, that's naturally going to want to make it go right. Overstable wants to lean into that kind of spin. Understable wants to go against that type of spin. So we've rambled on putters enough, but like I said, I think it's a super important part, and I do believe that we need all 3 of these slots for sure in the bag. All right, let's talk about mid-ranges. Once again, we have an overstable, neutral, and understable option when it comes to those mid-ranges. Now, do I think all 3 of these are necessary? And I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't think that they're all super necessary, especially that really overstable option that we're looking for in the mid-range option. I think for mid-ranges, when we talk about what's needed, let's start with the neutral option first. Like we talked about in putters, you can achieve this neutral option in one of 3 ways. The first is by having a disc that kind of flies pure neutral like an Innova Mako 3. It's not necessarily understable, but it's certainly not overstable either. As all the disc reviewers of the internet would tell you, it holds whatever line you put it on. You know what I'm saying? It's just fantastic. But like seriously, it's a really good disc for that slot. I think option 2 would be to teeter to one side or the other of that neutral to overstable side or that neutral to understable side, and allow yourself to either throw the disc on a little bit of anhyzer when it's on that overstable side and let it flex out a little bit, which means you're gonna throw it straight. Or if you have the understable slide, throw it with that, like I said, that hyzer angle where the disc is chilling down. It's gonna stand up and ride really straight. Now, the reason that I say that you don't need necessarily a super overstable option, like we talked about before on that extreme side, is because if you go too overstable, that's gonna be a lot more of a utility disc that you're not gonna find yourself leaning on very much. However, if we go to the understable side of mid-ranges, like we talked about with speed and putters, you most likely are going to be able to get a a mid-range up to speed as well, even if you have a newer arm or you're newer to the game. So leaning in the understable option gives you the opportunity to throw those hyzer flips like we talked about before. This is going to allow you another straight option, which can get you some incredible distance really easily, but also maybe you need to throw a backhand to get the disc right if you're a right-handed player, or get left if you're a left-handed player throwing on that backhand. I think that especially as a newer player, the flexibility that you're going to get from an understable disc as well as a neutral disc, you're going to see a lot of shot options between those two, rather than if you went without the understable option. I think that there's a lot of power you're going to need behind your throws, rather than being able to focus on touch and slow your form down and throw it nice and easy, which is going to allow you more accuracy and consistency while you're on the course. Which means our total discs is not going to be 7 on the other side of this, but I think we're actually going to leave it at 6. Yeah, this is it. This is the one we're talking about. Get it? Because it's an it. Anywho, next up on the docket, obviously, is going to be fairway drivers, which is anything usually pertaining from that about 6 speed up to a 9 speed. Some people are going to throw 10 speeds in there. Some people are going to throw 9 speeds as distance drivers. Kind of just depends who you're talking to. For some of our newer players, this is the part where we're going to start getting to that speed number, that first number in the flight numbers becoming relevant. Because as we step up to a 9 speed or even a 10 speed, if you're lowering that into the fairway driver category, you may not be able to inject enough spin and power into the disc to actually get it to fly according to those numbers. Another thing to note about drivers, even starting with fairway drivers, is that they're going to have a more sharp nose on them. They're going to have this sort of sharper angle, which makes them able to cut through the wind, which is the whole point of a driver. But also it means that in that cutting through the wind, they become a lot more angle sensitive to the wind, which means that if we don't throw them correctly, they aren't even going to go as far as maybe your mid-ranges or your putters can, which are a lot more blunt, which means they care a lot less about that nose angle and how you throw it. So they kind of ride the wind versus fighting through the wind. So with our overstable, neutral, and understable options inside of the fairway department, I think we could take the same approach that we took on the mid-ranges and say that the understable fairway is really good for us. A neutral to overstable fairway is going to be good, and we can just leave the super overstable fairway out of it. I think here, especially for a newer player, we certainly want to make sure we have an understable fairway driver option. For lots of players, this understable option is going to be one of your furthest flying discs and options available to you, just because that understability means that when I throw it on a backhand, when I throw it with that sort of outside edge being down, it's going to make it want to stand up and fight more, which means it's going to want to get that extra distance and that extra glide that we're looking for. Now, depending on how understable of a fairway you choose to go, I think that you can actually eliminate this maybe neutral slot and step into something that lands between neutral and overstable. This could be something like a T-bird or a stalker or a eagle or a volt. There are a host of options out there that fill this slot, and it's going to give you a ton of options to your game so that you can really lean into something and start learning to throw more of those overstable options while still having that understable disc available. If you choose to go super understable with your understable option, then maybe something that is a little more neutral is going to work out in your favor, like a Crave. But I 100%, if you have a mold minimal bag or a disc minimal bag, am not going to recommend something super overstable, especially in the fairway slot, because I think that utility that you're gonna get out of that option, we can actually get in a different disc, which is gonna accomplish some more things as well. So after fairways, the disc count's gonna jump up to 8. All right, we've arrived at the big guns. Time to talk about distance drivers. This is definitely going to be the case for loads of players out there who do not have the arm speed or the ability to eject enough spin and power into the disc to get distance drivers to fly as they need. So does that mean that they should just avoid them altogether and never have a distance driver in their bag? I would tell you that I think for most people, the answer could be sure. It would be all right if you don't have any of these options in your bag. But I do think with the wider rim that you get from the distance drivers, the overstability that it's naturally going to have because you cannot get it up to speed, it's actually going to work out in your favor. So what I would recommend for that is rather than having a disc in the super understable slide or in the super overstable side, having a disc that lives more neutral that you may not be able to get up to speed like an 11 speed or a 12 speed is actually going to fill a couple of roles for you. When you really need a disc to fight through the wind and get through and get forward, a neutral distance driver can work out really well for you in that category. If you need to fulfill that super overstable slot that we did not grab from a fairway driver, having this can also fill that role as well. And I think that the third thing this really does well is it gives you a disc to grow into. I think that having certain options, maybe that we're not leaning on all of the time, but discs that we can sort of say, hey, I think I'm gaining some improvement. How is this disc flying for me now? Keeping it around, keeping it near you, and once again, not leaning on it all the time so that we learn bad habits while we're throwing can be super useful to have in your bag. Bring our distance driver and total discount up to 9. However, I want to talk about one more disc that I think is super useful that you could even drop some of the drivers to just have this in your bag if you want to keep it in single digits. So the last option that we're going to talk about, I have to set up what is the most reliable shot in disc golf or the most accurate shot in disc golf, and that is the hyzer. If you're unfamiliar with what hyzer means, because I've thrown out like so many words during this video and I've tried to give different definitions for them that can help relate to lots of players, especially if you're new to the sport. Welcome, glad to have you. A hyzer is that like crescent moon shape where it goes up and out and back in. Half moon, half circle, however you want to describe this. When we have a hyzer shot, we're less focused on necessarily throwing it flat and straight, and if it's going to turn over to the right or turn over to the left, we can just throw it out on this hook and it's going to come right back in. So the only thing we really have to worry about at that point is the distance of, we know the hook's going to come back, so how short or long do we need to leave it? And the disc that does this better than anything else are often overstable discs, because that means they want to lean into the spin that you're going to give them. So if you throw an overstable disc out wide, it's going to crash back in. And the disc slot that changed my game more than anything else was an overstable putt and approach. This is a disc that is not necessarily a mid-range, but it's not necessarily a putter either, but it is overstable and reliable. It works really well to teach people how to throw forehands. It works really well when you learn to throw it on backhands. And so this is a zone that I have in my hands, and it is Discraft's most popular putt and approach, and arguably, I would say, decent, would you say probably the most popular?
By the metrics that I sell here,
yeah. Yeah. So definitely the most popular, one of the most popular overstable putt and approach discs of all time. Obviously, if you know me, I believe that it's not the zone. Pig is love, pig is life, but that's okay. Overstable putt and approach disc, like I said, there is no mold that changed my game or my scorecards or slot than the overstable putt and approach. Every single manufacturer has multiple molds that accomplish this inside their lineup. So you really just got to feel which one you like versus which one you don't like and experience with this. I would definitely recommend having this mold in your bag over others. If you only had like 5 discs in your bag, I always try to make sure that I have this overstable putt and approach option for me, because once again, it is the most accurate shot, knowing you can just throw it out there, come back, makes those approaches easy, and even certain tee shots become easier when you can throw this option. So that brings our discs needed for the bag up to 10, but obviously we can adjust that with one final caveat that I really want to make sure that we talk about, and that is that, as you kind of heard with this, there are multiple shot shapes that I'm trying to hit. It's not necessarily about having one particular disc in your bag, because even on that putter slot, if you find a neutral enough putter that can fill those understable shot options and your straight options, then you don't necessarily need 2 discs in your bag to cover all of those slots. If you end up with discs that can do multiple options, that is always better than having necessarily 1 disc in your bag that is there for that specific shot on that specific hole. I would much rather us learn to have more flexibility with our discs and our options. So while I say that 10 is the number that I think if we were totally minimalizing this down to, as you expand and you find sort of nuances in your game, you can see that, hey, I have discs that cover this understable options and discs that cover this neutral option, but I kind of find myself indecisive during this shot. That's as you expand your bag that you want to fill those holes and those opportunities, rather than just simply saying, this is is the law and this is what I have to have in my bag. I'd be very curious what you guys think of these 10 slots and if there's any that you would recommend having versus not having, or ones that I said, yeah, I don't think you need this, and you actually think you need that shot. Let us know in the comments down below. As always, I want to say thank you for watching and thank you for tuning in. I hope you have an amazing rest of the week and that you can make it fantastic for someone else too. If you want to talk more about bag stuff and what we've got going, feel free to check out Brad and I's podcast over on the Foundation Podcast Network, once again called In the Bag. In the meantime, keep it real, keep it great, but for now, we're gonna leave you with the birdie.